by disease and hunger and thirst, all in the name of fighting some war that they never even got into because Alexander had kept them sitting on the sidelines. Those who had gotten to fight had been pointlessly marched through Armenia and back until they were almost all dead. And now on top of everything else, the very fact of their absence had led their families back home to be slaughtered by marauding Germans. Pissed off does not even begin to describe the mood of the Danube legions. Both to head off a full-blown insurrection, and because it was the right thing to do, Alexander quickly picked up the army he had stationed in Antioch, and, leaving behind a few garrisons to keep an eye on the Sassanids, marched the rest west to drive back the Germans and exact a little revenge. As he marched through Moesia and Pannonia, he redeposited some of the various Danube troops back in their home camps, and allowed them to clean up the mess that had been made in their absence. The rest of the army kept marching with Alexander all the way to the Upper Rhine, where the German incursions had been heaviest. But once situated in Germany, Alexander quickly reminded everyone that at the end of the day, he really did not want to lead an army in battle. After crossing the great river on a pontoon bridge in a showy display of force, the emperor sent word to the various German chiefs offering terms of peace, which included payments of cash and other considerations in exchange for a cessation of hostilities. This was the last straw. The legions Alexander had brought with him from the east described to their west agreed that history was repeating itself. The Germans had plundered Roman territory, and Alexander's response was to offer them more treasure. This growing anger didn't even yet take into account the fact that with their reduced pay, the men were clamoring for an invasion of Germania so they could do some plundering of their own. Over the winter of 234-235, the rank and file mumbled and grumbled to each other, and the possibility of rebellion went from secret desire to open conspiracy. The only thing standing between Alexander and assassination was that the men had no leader willing to head their revolt. In February 235, though, that all changed, and a general named Maximinius Thrax was about to become the first barbarian emperor of Rome. The career of Maximinius is fascinating for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which because he is the one character who really stood out to me the first time I read any part of the Decline and Fall back when I was a kid. The rest of Gibbon was just indecipherable gobbledygook that I couldn't make heads or tails out of, but when he started talking about this gigantic barbarian who as a teenager easily bested the strongest men in the legions and then rose up the ranks to become emperor, well, that I understood. What I didn't understand at the time was what a momentous event his claim to the throne represented in the broader sweep of Roman history. Maximinius Thrax had been born in the early 170s AD, and tradition holds that he was the son of a peasant family in Thrace, hence the Thrax, which roughly makes his name Maximinius the Thracian. But it is also possible that he was born and raised in Moesia. As with the exact location of his birth, his heritage is similarly a matter of some debate. The Historia Augusta, now beginning to slip into unreliability, claim that he was born of a Gothic father and a Sarmatian mother, but most other Roman writers describe him as being Thraco-Roman, that is, a fully settled and Romanized Thracian, rather than a barbarian, in the sense that his parents came from communities beyond the frontier. He was first noticed during the reign of Septimius Severus, when the emperor was returning from one of his eastern campaigns, probably the first one following his victory over Niger in 194. Legend has it that after halting the day's march, the legions decided to engage in some friendly sport with the locals. Young Maximinius showed up and proceeded to toss every soldier the legions threw at him. Severus was impressed, but he was even more impressed the next day, when the young man jogged alongside his horse until the emperor agreed to let him join the legions. And the emperor was even more impressed when, after jogging for God knows how many miles, Maximinius still bested the dozen or so soldiers Severus ordered him to wrestle as a final test. Maximinius made an excellent soldier, He was, after all, a head taller than just about every other man in the army. He is described as being 8 Roman feet tall, which is basically 8 modern feet tall, and while I find that very hard to believe, I'm willing to believe that he was significantly larger than his contemporaries, not unlike Charlemagne, who is also described as being a gigantic 8 feet tall. But despite his excellence as an infantryman, he was never slated for higher command, and for a long time looked destined for the standard 25 years service and a gold watch. But over time, he did rise up the ranks, and when Alexander Severus took over, his governing council recommended the Thracian for a slot running the training of new recruits in Pannonia. In this post, Maximinius thrived. He was stern and demanding, but he also reveled in leading by example. Whatever he expected his men to do, he did himself first. He never sat back and ordered his men around. He always got down in the mud with them and shared in the hard, dirty, and exhausting work of learning how to be a Roman soldier. This teaching style endeared him to each successive wave of recruits, and pretty soon, a majority of the men serving along the Danube had been personally trained by Maximinius Thrax, and so a majority of the men serving along the Danube loved him to death and would have followed him to hell and back. When the Germans began overrunning the border in 234, Maximinius was put in charge of a legion, and he was already working hard to counter the German menace when Alexander arrived on the scene a few months later. We don't really know what his level of involvement was with the growing mutiny prior to February 235, but we can say for pretty certain that Maximinius had no love for Alexander. Though the young emperor was the man who had finally given Maximinius a real shot at power, the Thracian had long ago developed a hatred for the Roman aristocracy, and soft, refined Alexander was the undisputed leader of the Roman aristocracy.
Somewhere out there,
the rich old men of Rome had never let Maximinius forget his humble origins, nor had their slaves failed to treat him as something beneath even their own lowly station. He found the capital to be nothing but a snake pit of backstabbing weaklings who pretended that they were better than everyone else. By 235, Maximinius was dedicated to his soldiers, and they were dedicated to him. The rest of the empire, politicians, civilians, whatever, were simply in the way. So when Alexander once again tried to make peace before Rome had made its point, this time offering money to boot, it is easy to believe that Maximinius did not exactly clamp down on seditious activity in his camp. But still, however he felt, we still don't know whether his troops' decision to declare him emperor in February 235 was orchestrated in advance or actually came as a surprise. Whatever the prearrangements had been, when Maximinius rose to address his troops one wintry morning, the men spontaneously hailed him emperor and demanded that he agree to the job. After the requisite amount of protest, Maximinius reluctantly agreed, and the rebellion against Alexander Severus was on. After doubling everyone's rations and promises, Maximinius ordered his troops to begin marching on Alexander's camp just a few miles down the road. Messengers from Maximinius's army arrived in advance of the main force, and after announcing the rebellion, attempted to convince Alexander's soldiers to join up. There are a few versions of what happened next, with one stating that Alexander spoke to his men, promised them all kinds of bonuses if they stuck with him, and actually had gotten them mustered in the field before any defections took place, while another version has the emperor left totally in the dark about everything, and not learning of the plot until Maximinius's executioners pushed their way into his tent. Whichever way it went, as soon as Maximinius arrived, Alexander's soldiers defected en masse and swore their loyalty to the Thracian. Not one to beat around the bush, Maximinius ordered a tribune to lead a few centurions into Alexander's camp to find and kill the emperor. The assassins found the young emperor in his tent, with his mother and a few loyal advisors by his side, and after very little struggle, the Severans all lay bloody on the floor. Alexander was 26 years old, and had done his very best over the 13 years he ruled the empire. The death of Alexander and the rise of Maximinus represented a major turning point for the empire. Over the last 137 years, beginning with Trajan and ending with Alexander, the average reign of an emperor was just over 12 years, and that includes the short reigns of Pertinax and Didius Julianus. For the next 50 years, beginning with the elevation of Maximinus and ending with the elevation of Diocletian, that average will plunge to something like one emperor for every 2 years, depending on how you do the math. And that doesn't include the fact that for a while there, the empire was split in 3, as major breakaway kingdoms in the east and west threatened to destroy the unity of the Roman Empire forever. No one could have guessed it at the time, but the assassination of Alexander Severus marked the beginning of a period where the very survival of Rome was very much in doubt. Foreign invasion, domestic strife, plague, and famine would all conspire to bring the Roman Empire to the brink of extinction, a possibility they had not faced since Hannibal had come marching out of the Alps 4 centuries earlier. Finally, remember when I said last week that I would be making an official announcement about the History of Rome tour pretty soon? Well, here it is. The History of Rome tour is set for May 2011, and I couldn't be more excited. We have designed a 10-day trip that takes us from Rome to Istanbul, and hits as many highlights as we could possibly cram in along the way. We'll spend a few days in and around Rome, before snaking down through Capua, to Pompeii, to Tarentum and Brindisi, and then over to the city the Romans called Constantinople. The itinerary is too packed for me to just rattle off everything right now, so for the full details, I'll direct you to the website that we've set up, historyofrometour.com. That again, historyofrometour.com. We have guides and lecturers and experts lined up to walk us through every one of our stops, answer our questions, and generally make sure that we don't miss a single thing while we're there. The package also includes hotels, transportation, breakfast, some group dinners, admission to all the museums and historical sites, and even the transatlantic airfare, if you live in the US and need that sort of thing. And of course, Mr. and Mrs. The History of Rome will both be along for the ride. Space is limited, and we're going to have to run this on a first-come, first-served basis, but I will tell you that we've discussed what happens if more people want to go on the trip than we have space for, and after agreeing that that would be a great problem to have, the answer came back a resounding, we'll do multiple trips. So all the info is at historyofrometour.com, the itinerary, the costs, and an FAQ page that will start populating as soon as we figure out what questions people are frequently asking. I'll also post a permanent link at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com. One other thing I'll mention is that I'm going to be plugging an announcement of the trip onto the back episodes, so that people who aren't all the way caught up will know what's going on. This shouldn't alter any episodes that you've already downloaded, but I just wanted you all to know what I'm up to. The History of Rome Tour, May 2011. Sign up right now.